Okay, hi.
Hey,
Yeah, how did it go since last time?
so I haven't had that much time to work on grammar stuff, but I'm halfway through the Mises section, um, which is good. What I've done so far, I figured the main part of that issue was the big sentence in the middle of that thing. I've got the paragraph here that I can copy if that helps. Um, uh, yeah, and I tried to figure it out because I had trouble reading it the first time too. Um, and so I tried to figure it out, and I came up with something different to you. I'm not actually sure if it means different things yet, um, but yeah. But at the very least, it's different.
Okay,
I've
can you
tried to.
put that in tutoring channel?
Yep, sure thing. Uh, do you want me to include the first one too? The like paragraph itself.
Yeah.
Yep. Um, all right, it's a little bit awkward because of the markdown stuff, but and then that's the original paragraph. Oh, just while you're doing that, I'm just going to grab a drink. I'll be back in a sec. So I haven't actually finished your analysis of it. So that, uh, yeah, where I put your analysis there, that's a bit of a guess. But it's what I predicted, or where it was going.
The whole thing is under whether they're in a position to determine something.
Yeah, one thing I didn't like was like about mine is it sort of implies like it says they would one of the ways to read part of like they would demonstrate by what could be done and how, but they would by withdrawing the scarce factors jeopardize. And so then it's like they'd be doing the jeopardization as opposed to the position sort of determining something.
Yeah, the issue is whether they are able to know what would happen.
Mm. Yes, yep. Um,
Um, did you make a grammar tree for this?
uh, no, I've sort of I mean, I was doing some analysis in the last 12 hours or so. Um, but I had a sort of realization that sometimes doing a grammar tree might be like a distraction from trying to understand the sentence. So that was in uh what do you call it? In the tutoring thing, I linked a PDF of analyzing a paragraph about Zaz that I just found Googling stuff. And I was planning on analyzing a weird Academy's complex sentence. And yeah, I figured that would actually be a distraction from trying to figure out or trying to do the goal of that. So I did sort of like something that I referred to as an outline tree instead. So sort of trying to capture some of the structure, but not doing a full grammatical analysis, which
Yeah,
admittedly might have a higher error rate, but is quicker and yeah, and not as prone to making mistakes in like I was with doing complex grammar analysis.
yeah, you can definitely break it into chunks for the tree instead of single word nodes. You can
Hmm.
put like an entire noun phrase in a node without worrying about how it breaks up, and then that
Yep.
shortens the amount of stuff you have to do.
In
But
this
you
case, though, I don't think I
still deal
brought
with
it.
all the conjunctions. For example, the conjunction structure tends to be important.
Yep. So I realized like or is actually like after I'd sort of done this, that there is actually a conjunction in there I could have um,
Yeah, this
used
one
that
is
I
a
didn't.
keyword,
Which one's this one? Sorry.
or the or.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yeah. So admittedly, I was a little rushed doing this. I decided to have a nap instead of spending more time on this, which I think is probably the right decision. But yeah.
Yeah, the core structure is they would not be in a position. It's hard to cut some of the words, but they would determine whether, sort of like that.
Oh, yeah, yep. Yeah, whether or weather is that occurred to me as the point where the like sort of like that. I might just copy this to work on it down there as oh.
The increase and the jeopardize are also keywords. These are some of the main verbs about what's going on. Like this section has to do with increasing, and this section has to do with jeopardizing.
Yeah. Um it's definitely the I feel like the sort of the parent or I think it's a parenthetical, the by part, um
Yeah, the
by withdrawing.
by is a modifier.
Um it's maybe not parenthetical in that it's required, but it's definitely it really makes the sentence more complex to read, particularly because of the other commas later on.
Right, so that's why I suggested a tree. Reading that by clause is a good example of something that's tricky in prose, but in tree form, it has its own subtree and it doesn't interact with the other subtrees. Like you just give it its own branch and
Mm,
then it's sort of out of the way. So it doesn't really
yep,
make it much harder to understand the overall thing because it's just an extra detail lower down.
yep, yep. And you can just
Like you'll have the
uh
by node and then all the other words will be nested under it. So you can even
yep.
collapse them if your tree software does collapsing.
Anyway, yeah. In terms of the what do you call it? The that PDF. I'm not sure if it's particularly important to analyze. In that I sort of like met my goals with it. Um, which I wrote down on the bottom left.
Did you come to a conclusion about this, whether it was any good?
Um, I so there were a few things like yeah. So my conclusion was that it wasn't very good, but I found a one of the references that they made was to Zaz Under Fire, which seems at first impressions a lot like I know Karl Popper had some books or a book where
Yeah,
he was
his
responding to
replies to his
critics,
critics book.
and that's what Zaz Under Fire feels like. And that Zaz is one of the authors. I understand there was some kind of challenge that was sort of issued as such. So it seems like if I wanted to know more, then I'd go there. That was essentially the conclusion that I came to because any arguments like in this section were probably made better in the book by someone else, and then I've actually got a reply there from him as opposed to someone sort of digesting stuff and deciding that his reply wasn't worth it or something like that. Um, which, given the quality of the article, uh, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't do a great job.
Right. So their main point seems to be that Szasz didn't deal with non-Western ideas about mental illness.
In so it's a weird um, sort of thing in that there's like the paragraph itself sort of has this non sequitur where it refers to like something that Kendall's pointing out about like the definition of disease, and then it goes off on a tangent about, but spends a lot more time in the sentence about it, or in the thing about it, about what do you call it, this non-Western thing, or it like switches from non-Western to idiosyncratic nature and so on, but trying to figure out what they meant, it seems like. Yeah. But I found that was a weird thing to bring up because the non-Western view doesn't agree with the authors. So it's sort of like, why bring that point up and why would you criticize Zaz for not addressing that when the people he's addressing are Western authors of a traditional view? Like the Western authors don't agree with that point of view. They're just sort of saying this is a different one and uh, he might have noticed that his argument was weird if he paid attention to them, but I'm not sure that his argument is weird in that context because, like, the only real citation I could find, like, 3 out of the 5 citations for that statement weren't uh, like accessible. Um, 2 of them just outright I couldn't find a copy of, and one of them was behind a paywall. One was a book where there was a little bit of a sample, and then one was actually
Oh,
a paper. But in the abstract of the paper, it like I think I quote it somewhere. Um,
so basically you didn't find out what the non-Western conception is and how it answers Szasz,
I
despite trying to
like
check his sites.
it didn't seem like it answered SARS at all. Like because they're sort of like had he considered non-Western ideas, the somewhat idiosyncratic nature of his argument might have been apparent to him because uh like physiological abnormality isn't what is the means of validating like mental disorders in non-Western conceptualizations, except that the non-Western conceptualizations are also against like medicine for stuff like depression. It was particularly depression was the thing. So I'm not sure Zaz would have made it like taken issue with it, particularly because in the snippets of Zaz Under Fire that I read, he sort of like explicitly points out that like mental illness isn't a meaningless term. It's useful in other ways, but it's like not meaningful in a way of trying to take it literally. Um, in terms of referring to people, and that he's makes a point of saying that he's not against like psychiatry, he's against like for psychiatry, like consensual psychiatry is fine. So I'm not sure that he would have an issue with a non-Western, or if he did, it would be a different one. Um, yeah. So at least based on the one citation I could find, which is
It's pretty bad
always
that
a
he
bit of
gives 5 sites, but you can't actually get info.
one of them was a book where it was like 15 out of 100 pages were accessible, maybe less. So I didn't look too much into that because so much of it was not accessible. And then Zaz Under Fire is on Google Books, but there's some pages missing. I'm not sure what proportion, but chunks of this Kendall guy's uh, sort of criticisms were there, and they seem to sort of roughly be on topic. Um, at that point, though, I was realizing that I was spending a lot of time on it, and I didn't really need to in order to make a conclusion. I'd already found like a good alternative.
Okay. So are we caught up on stuff you've done then? Do you have any outstanding questions or open issues or things you wanted to work on?
Um, so, well, I don't think we finished talking about the Mises paragraph. I just wanted to bring this up as an example of like realizing that I didn't need to do a full tree. Um, uh, but otherwise, I think so. Yeah, I haven't. I had like a deadline thing. So I haven't had that much free time um since Wednesday.
Okay. Um, do you want to work on the Mises paragraph or do you want to save that until after you finish watching the video?
Um, well, since I sort of, I mean, I feel like maybe I should finish the video first, in that there might be a lot of questions that are answered there.
Yeah, possibly.
Um, yeah, and then I can actually spend some time and make a proper tree of it. Because I presume you don't do that in the video. But that'll help me figure out whether it's right or not, my understanding.
Okay. Yeah, so then do you have any open issues or questions right now?
Um, so uh, there was something I was thinking of trying to write that might be, or I guess one of the things that I've been thinking a bit about is um, writing within my capacity. So, like some of the ideas that I've chosen to think about and write about over the past week have been beyond my capacity. Um, and it sort of occurs to me that maybe I have a bad intuition about that. Um, I was thinking
Yeah,
about just yeah, Justin's recent article as sort of an example because it seemed like the article was fairly straightforward. Um, and on the whole, I liked it. Uh, and I was trying to think about why certain things would be within capacity and some things wouldn't. I guess I don't have a good answer for that. Um, the topic that I was thinking about writing about was to do with the categorization of legislation. So yeah, so that's the article. Um,
yeah. So what did you think this was an example of specifically?
I thought this was so my rough impression is like Justin has a smaller capacity than you do for doing philosophical stuff. Um, and there's a lot of topics you could write about in terms of like criticisms and emotional reactions and things like this. And this article seemed to me to restrict this like the scope, or he chose to restrict the scope of what he was writing about. Like there were other questions that came up in my mind when I was reading this, but they all seemed more complex. Like they were like more complete analyses or things like that. Um, and so this seemed like an example of a scope restriction such that it was easier to write, I guess.
Okay, a couple things. First, I think that this article is bad. There are a lot of problems with it. And that he should have written something much simpler. Like he's doing an 8-part article. So what he should have done is similar to what I was going to say you should do, which is if you're concerned about capacity or that kind of thing, do something successful. Like establish a baseline of what you can do successfully. Make a project that came out really well. And then you see, okay, I can do that. To do that, the best way to do it is to scale way, way down. Do something you're like really confident of, like really, really confident. Like get your first one should be like, 3 orders of magnitude below your capacity so that you actually get one done and it doesn't take very long and so on. And then you can do the
Yep.
next one 2 orders of magnitude below what you think your capacity is. And the next one like 1 order of magnitude below. And that way you'll quickly be scaling up to getting closer to the borderline while establishing a track record that you can actually do some of the stuff you think you can do. Because a lot of people approach it from above. They're doing stuff that's over the line and then they reduce it to stuff that's less over the line and they keep doing that, and that can be a very long process with a lot of failure.
Yeah,
And
yep.
so I think
That's
it's a lot better to come from the other side.
yeah, and that's what I feel like I've been doing. Um, is that, and that's also like a I guess like a more painful way to do things, in that it feels like you're coming up against blockers or like walls every time, as opposed to like having successes, which feels like a more positive way to approach it.
Yeah, people I find are very impatient and they want to do like the good stuff, the deep end of the pool right away, and it's hard to get them to chill out and do just a few easier things and establish like some track record.
Yeah. Um,
And then, yeah, if you do a 10x increase and then you run into trouble, then you go back to the last known good point and you do a smaller increase from there, like only 2x, and see what happens.
yep. Um, so there's two things that occur to me. One is an aside where um, uh, I was wondering whether it might be a good idea to analyze like something I wrote a long time ago, um, like 2013. Um, it's smaller in scope, but and it was probably overreaching definitely at the time. But that might be useful. But the other thing that occurs to me on topic is uh, like uh, talking about what I was thinking about writing, and then trying to figure out what should I tackle that's that 3 orders below capacity type estimate. Um, yeah, because I think if I just try to pick something that's 3 orders below magnitude, then like I'm not sure I'd do a very good job of that.
Yeah, for that, you probably want to start by taking something that's not very complicated or hard that you understand really well, and then explaining it. Like how to use a dishwasher, for example.
Yep. Um, I'll just type this out so I get it out of my head.
But that's not a great example because that's something you can probably do okay, but you probably haven't like thought about it a lot. So if you can think of something you have more mastery of that you've actually studied a bit, that could work better.
So yeah, something about coding. I mean, the democracy stuff is a weird in between in that I've spent like a lot of time thinking about it and discussing it with people, but it's also like it doesn't mean that my understanding would be very good, in that I don't have particularly that much of a track record, and other people haven't spent that much time thinking about it either. Um,
Yeah,
whereas like coding stuff or something to do with programming would be an easy example maybe of somewhere where I can pick something pretty small by comparison.
right. Like
Um,
you could probably do what's the difference between imperative and functional programming, but
yeah,
that's not like mainstream or general purpose. If you could do something that would be accessible to like everyone, that would be preferable, especially at the beginning.
yeah, it increases the number of people who could give me feedback at the very least.
Yeah, and it's also like it makes our cultural standards for quality and knowledge and so on more applicable. Like people have sort of a general sense of what an educated person should know and what quality their writing should be and so on. And then if you work in a small niche, it's harder to apply regular judgments. You end up with more field-specific judgments. So it makes some common sense rules of thumb, etc., less applicable.
Yeah, okay. Um, and first thought is that at a bit of an impasse because a lot of the stuff that when I think about like things that are general, um, like the first thing that comes to mind is like morality stuff, but that I don't think is like that still feels like a lot to bite off and chew, and it'd be very easy to pick something that's not good. Sort of similar to my what do you call it, appearance integrity article thing. Like there were yeah, decent number of issues with that. Um,
Right. So like a lot of
so
people could do a makeup tutorial. I'm assuming not you. A lot of people could do a cooking tutorial. I don't know if you've ever had cooking as a hobby. You know, a lot of people could do a
not
carpentry
particularly.
tutorial or a car mechanic tutorial, or even like some sort of computers for dummies kind of tutorial. And those would
One thing
be
that
like more accessible.
um, so one thing I noticed even going back years, like a decade, um, when I understood something or I felt like I understood something, particularly when it was like a complex idea, um, I found I had a lot of trouble trying to simplify it. I guess that's something where I'm like much better at now, like particularly in the past month and a half. Um, the example that comes to mind is like talking to people about Bitcoin back in like 2012 or 2013. The in that I felt like I had a good technical understanding, but my ability to communicate it was usually pretty poor. Um, So, and I guess what I mean by that is that like if I did a tutorial like computers for dummies, I'm not sure I'd really know where to start. Because I've got like a huge library of knowledge
Oh,
comparatively.
yeah. So computers like as a whole is too big a topic. You can pick like a really specific thing like um, how to install Debian on your PC instead of Windows, or like how to make it a dual boot
Yeah,
would be a
okay.
narrower topic.
Um, is writing a tutorial instead of like an essay type thing, are there any issues there? I guess in terms of, well, that would depend on the goal, right? Um,
Yeah, it doesn't matter that much. Like the point is to write coherent prose where people can understand what you're saying and to communicate ideas. It's like another one that this one I think is a pretty good general one that you could probably do is explaining basic math concepts like how does the base 10 system work? So
hmm.
that like a regular person would have a chance to understand it if they actually tried.
Um, is like talking about bases in general, is that an example of like that order of magnitude jump? I guess pun not intended because base 10, but
Yeah,
yeah, because I have thought a lot about different bases, um, including uh, like I rediscovered type thing a a weird base system called factoratics, where like the position of each digit has the number of possibilities as like the factorial of the position number. I think -1 because factorial one being one doesn't sort of there's no benefit to having only one digit. So the first position has uh yeah, so that's I've got a like at least one fairly deep uh like thing that I've thought of there. Um that was regarding encoding permutations. So if you had like a list of things, the most efficient way to encode it is via this base system. There might be other equivalent ways, but it's fundamentally the must
right.
be the most efficient because of what do you call it? Um, the amount of information is the most condensed that way. It's like, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
equal to the number of permutations, essentially.
Yeah, I read
Um,
a paper about base 3 computation a while ago. It was interesting, but it's not like very relevant here. The point is like what are the basic concepts of how our number system works to
yeah.
understand that and to be able to explain it.
So it occurs to me though, these three things might be like a good three order of magnitude difference. I mean, obviously factoratics is pretty, like, as in that's getting pretty specialized. But yeah, how base 10 works, and then like bases, I mean, even maybe even like, I mean, computation in general, like, you know, you could talk about addition in base 12 or stuff like that as well.
Yeah,
Maybe
one of
these.
the issues with those later ones is they're getting into specifics and calculation, whereas my focus was on the conceptual side. Like, why is the number system designed this way? Why does this design make sense? How is it useful? Like more practical knowledge. How do you use it?
Yeah, okay.
Which I think a lot of people don't actually understand very well.
Yeah. I think I find it easier to write about stuff when there's like a problem in mind. Um, that's actually something that I was wondering is whether
Yeah. So
the
there are a
frame.
lot of problems here. Like base 10 solves a problem. So figuring out what problems it's solving and how it solves them would be one of the things you could write about.
Um, occurs to me we can like generate a problem by comparing to stuff that came before it, like Roman numerals and stuff like that. Um, like that's something that people are usually fairly familiar with Roman numerals or tally systems. Um,
That's a
uh,
very non-representative sample. Your friend group that's familiar with Roman numerals is not representative of the typical population, FYI.
um, yeah, okay. We've got like years and stuff. Well, people, well, okay, maybe people have like a
Like,
general idea
I
they
also
exist.
run into a lot of people who know how Roman numerals work, but I'm pretty sure most people don't.
No, okay, but tally systems would be something that people know how they work.
Probably that sounds plausible.
I think most, well, it seems like I remember learning it really early at school, um, or at least I'm fairly sure. Definitely primary school. Um, uh, but even if people haven't used them or don't understand how they work, they're simple enough to explain as part of the
Yeah,
article to sort of explain where a problem comes from, and then like contrast that with why don't we use these things sort of thing. And that sounds like a fairly approachable, yeah, sort of topic.
yeah. Just make sure it doesn't balloon too much. Like, start with a small scope.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's lots of other math things you can do, like what is division? This is a concept that I think a lot of people would have some difficulty explaining if they actually had to.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of
Um,
people are
that
confused by fractions, ratios, and percents. In fact, there are textbooks that teach what ratios are incorrectly and say basically that you can convert a ratio like 1 to 10 to a fraction by writing 1 over 10.
yeah, yep. Um, that stuff is yeah, pretty common. It's also I mean, it's a thing that like I still sometimes make mistakes with converting ratios to fractions if I'm trying to do it like quickly or to do something else. Um, like the other day I was talking with a friend about there's like this idea that if you're drawing someone, then the head to body ratio is 1 to 7. And my like I was thinking about 1 to 6 and 1 to 8, and I got them the wrong way around in terms of thinking about which one was going to be bigger and smaller with the relative stuff. So
Yeah, a lot of people don't have much practice working with ratios, so it's not as automated as some other math,
mm,
including me. Like, I haven't used them very much. So if I was dealing with them, I'd have to take my time a bit.
yeah, yeah, likewise. I imagine that like one of the only places that occurs to me where people, because they're so much like, because they're more confusing than uh like using fractions and stuff. like betting comes up as like occurs to me as one of the places where people use ratios a lot, like 3-to-1 odds or something like that. That would be another thing that might be a relevant topic, or at least like a good example in an article about ratios or something like that.
Yeah, and then on a more advanced note, ratios make it convenient to do Bayesian updating math.
Yeah, okay. I think I've got an intuition of what you mean, just thinking about probability, but I'm not certain what, yeah, Bayesian updating maths necessarily means.
Well, yeah, we don't need to go into that.
I agree. Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah.
So this makes more
So,
sense.
yeah, trying to explain something like one of the ways to do it is imagine you're talking to like a 5-year-old, so he just doesn't know a lot of standard stuff. So you can do it with like science stuff too, like what's gravity or why does the Earth go around the sun or something. Or like, what happens when you boil water? Why does it like start disappearing from the pot? And if you like boil it long enough, then the pot gets empty. Why does a
Yeah.
mirror like show an image of yourself? Like you can think of a lot of sort of basic scientific questions.
Um, there's also then just with the mirror, uh, so like one thing that I feel like people would not, I'd need to sit down and think about it for a minute from like first principles, but why mirrors only like flip
Oh yeah, I
the
understand.
image in
I'm
one
familiar
direction?
with that problem.
Yeah. Um, uh, yeah, it's like an order of magnitude harder, but still something that I think I could do with pretty low error rate, like well, with practically zero errors if I spent time on it. Or maybe not. That would be finding that stuff out, I guess. Um, I have been realizing more and more how much I've like forgotten that I used to know. Like I was thinking about a probability thing the other day that I don't know how complex it would really be. Actually, it's probably reasonably complex as a problem, but it's like trying to take uh, numbers about trials that someone would do and figure out what the confidence interval they calculated for is. Um, if that makes sense.
Trials and confidence intervals, yeah, like statistics. How do you get 95% probability or whatever?
Yeah. Um, yeah. It's to do with like figuring out whether uh like the membership of an organization meets some sort of criteria. And you've got certain standards for the maximum number of like members on a list you can make, and then depending on that number, you get a certain number of like failures. But they only sample a certain
Yeah,
number of people depending on the size of the list. So there's actually like 4 or 5 variables in there. Um, maybe th
yeah,
3 at minimum.
yeah. A
But
similar
that's
problem is how could we simplify our elections with random sampling? Like how many people would we need to randomly pick to vote in order to
oh
like
yeah.
save a lot of effort? It's a kind of similar issue. Like how many people do you need to get a certain level of confidence that you're accurately representing the electorate?
Um, that's an interesting sort of problem and something that might actually fit in with the flux stuff and whatever. Um, yeah, but again, that's pretty complicated by comparison to the stuff we talked about earlier on.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So starting with explaining anything so that people actually understand it successfully. Like if you can get people who did not understand it to understand it, that is a type of writing success. That's not that easy to come by. Like a lot of people just fail over and over. So if you start with some of the easiest stuff you can, um, it may help you figure out what what works and what are like major failure modes, or like there will be problems you can run into that will make you fail even when you're explaining something really simple. And then so those are like very powerful types of errors in a way.
Errors with reached sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, like for example, if you used a political example, while trying to teach basic math and involve like race and IQ, then you'd like lose a lot of your audience.
Yeah. So in terms of like alienating topics being the error there.
Yeah, which, those aren't always an error. It depends on your goal. But if they're like irrelevant to your purpose, then generally just avoid them.
Yeah. One of the things that occurs to me about ratios as well is like, uh, so with the example of like 7 to 1 for the body ratio, um, I realize now I'm not actually clear what they meant because I presumed that it was like 1 unit is the size of the head. Um, that part is fine. But then 7 units, is that the size of the rest of the body or the size of the total? Because those, like if it was the size of
Yeah,
the total, then 1 to 7 is 1/7. But if it's the size of the rest of the body, then it's 1/8. Um,
yeah, yeah.
and
In
that's,
general, I would expect ratios to be like some parts of something to some parts of something else, not the total.
yeah,
Like
okay.
that to me is the proper default, but I don't know if everyone agrees with that.
Um,
It comes up with cooking. People, because they do like
yeah,
expansible recipes, so it's like 5 parts flour per 1 part sugar, which is definitely not 1/5 sugar. The 5 parts flour is
yes,
not the total.
yeah. So it looks like in terms of this, that's like 1 to 8, but
Yeah,
then I
well,
think
one eighth.
they say, or sorry, it's 1/8, it's 1 to 7, but they say down here, where is it? So they say 1/8, and then also not every person has a 1 to 8 head to body ratio, which is not what they actually. So there's
Yeah,
like a good example of that error right there.
yeah. I don't think they understand how ratios work.
Um, yeah. Um, well, that would be like maybe one of the topics like on ratios would be like how like ratios work. Um, oh,
Yeah, I'd suggest you start by doing a few that are like 1 paragraph long. Keep it really short and simple, and then get some feedback.
yeah, okay. Even thinking about some of the simple stuff that we've talked about. Well, I guess why a pot gets empty when it boils water. I think I might be able to do that in a paragraph. Um,
Yeah, like you don't
the
have to go into full scientific detail. You can pick a level of detail that would be useful to someone who doesn't know it.
Yeah, how base 10 works might be troublesome in a paragraph. Um,
Yeah,
that might relate to like another. I think I've mentioned it before, but like a problem where I can do like 1 or 2 lines or 1 or 2 sentences describing something, and then the next level up is like half a page plus. Um, where like 2 paragraphs would be challenging, but 4 or 5 paragraphs is doable, and 1 or 2 sentences is doable.
yeah, that makes sense to me. The way you're chunking the topic, like the different levels in your tree correspond there. And there are breakpoints within the topic itself. Breakpoints being something we talked about with yes or no philosophy.
Yep.
So yeah,
Um,
there are natural breakpoints in topics, which is why you like jump in level of detail. Like when you cross a breakpoint, you're now looking at it in a different way. There's like some significant difference. So you're like, it's like bringing up new issues or something.
um, I'm just wondering whether it's the case that like for topics that have those natural breakpoints, can you get around it? Like, could you write, or could one write 2 paragraphs and have all the words be meaningful? Like it's easy to fill it with fluff maybe, but
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's definitely ways you can do it. You can do like a longer overview. Like in general, you can take the overview approach and add more detail and more info, and just keep adding some extra stuff. Um, but it depends a lot on what your goal is. Like you can reorganize topics as well. Like you can come up with a different conceptual model of the topic and then write in that way.
yeah. Sort of reminds me when you were talking about some of the things um, where like writing and like expressing an idea in like 20 different ways. Um, that's something that I don't often do. Which actually reminds me of another question uh, to do with like the quality of one's writing, I guess is what I think is under this. But it's like the proportion of one's writing that's public. Like right now, granted there's like I'm putting a lot of stuff in the FI thing website here. Um, but right now pretty much everything I write is public. And it's traditionally been that way. I've got like a few drafts that I haven't released over the years, but that's maybe a 20% ratio or something like that, relatively speaking. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say that your public percentage should be between 20 and 80. Like there's a big range that's okay. But if you're getting to all or nothing, that's questionable.
yeah. Um, yeah. The one of the things about like say one's range was like up near 80, uh, it sort of seems like there should be like decent reasons for the stuff that's not public being not public. Like uh, most of the reason that I haven't published something is because I sort of like just never got around to finishing it in the level of detail that I wanted, or like going over it again or something like that, as opposed to like discarding it or not wanting to publish it outright, um, and deciding not to keep working on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's good to do some writing about introspection, journaling, personal stories, like IRL events, parochial stuff to do with your own life, and to, have some privacy, not expect to share all of that, but use writing to help you think through those things. So that's one source of private writing.
Hmm, that makes sense. Um, I've never really done a lot of that. Sometimes, I often will like talk through something with someone who I trust about that sort of stuff, which maybe is somewhat familiar, but definitely like different in significant ways as well.
Yeah. Another type of good writing practice you can try is come up with a problem and then brainstorm solutions. Generally, one sentence solutions are good and come up with a bunch of them. And try to write each sentence so it's like clear and understandable and people know what it is and so on. There's an example on Discord today from Justin. Yeah, so the problem was things to do to avoid tripping/falling while running.
Hmm.
Right, so like that's a problem where you could probably brainstorm 2 dozen ideas about partial solutions. They don't have to be full solutions.
Oh, you mean uh, like coming up with a list, but not an exhaustive list?
Well, it's not just that it's not an exhaustive list, but the things you can come up with solutions that would help but would not fully solve the problem. Like get better shoes is not going to make the problem entirely go away, but
Yep,
it could
yep.
help with the problem.
Um, yeah, or might solve the problem like in some selective cases. Like there was one case, for example, where I bought new shoes, particularly because the tread on the previous shoes had like worn off and it was like very rainy at that period.
Yeah.
And I was going up and down a lot of stairs and I didn't want to slip. And so that could like completely solve that problem. Um, but you need more context for that. So in general, it's a partial solution.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right. So you can come up with other problems to work on, like my dog is getting hair all over the house. What do I do? One sentence ideas. My two kids are fighting. What do I do?
Yeah,
And you
okay,
can
yeah.
try like very specific things, like this Lego set is missing a piece. What could I do? Versus very broad things. I don't like my job. What could I do? And like you don't even specify what the job is. So you could have a solution like if it's an architecture job, you could do this. If it's a plumbing job, you could do this. Like it gives you more scope to brainstorm.
Yeah, okay.
Like you allowing yourself to supply extra details of the problem situation is a useful skill. Like some problems are well specified and some are under specified, and you can come up with like if I added more specification to the problem that's compatible with the information I have, then what could I come up with?
Yep. Um, yeah. No, this is all good. I feel like I've definitely not calibrated uh my capability. Um,
Yeah, I have trouble getting people to do things like this very much, but I think it would help people. One of the things people did some on FI last year, I think it was, particularly just was reading very short stories. Some of them were meant for elementary school students, and then trying to analyze what did this story mean, what did it say, how can I summarize it. One of the things he was doing was paraphrase every sentence and then go through and try to decide which ones have the most important information in them so that he can then make a summary by taking only the paraphrases of the important parts. So it's like a very step-by-step process for how to narrow it down to make a summary.
yeah. Um, did you say Jess is her name?
Gist, Gist.
Oh yeah, yeah. Cool, gotcha. I think of that as like gisty in my head for whatever reason. But it's not a word, so I guess that's whatever. Um, yeah, okay. Um,
Yeah, one of the things that
but
came up is people had actual reading comprehension errors where they misunderstood like a plot point on elementary school reading assignments.
yeah. I feel like comprehension is one of those things where we tend to brush issues under the rug, and people, yeah, can go quite a way beyond that, um, without fixing it, uh, and then either develop bad habits or whatever else, or just sort of like ride on intuition, and because it doesn't come up that often, it doesn't impact them too much, or something like that.
Yeah,
Anything
I
like
really
it,
disagree with that perspective. I think a better view is wherever you're having problems, you should expect your limit, the point where you got stuck, to be like 1 to 3 orders of magnitude later. So it's gonna like if you never deal with it, you're never gonna get all that far past it. So if you're like aiming really high, it's going to matter a lot. Like you can go a ways past your errors and your error rate like gradually increases as you keep going. But like at some point it gets too high, and the more you build on something, the more it gets reused. Like a very low level function in a computer program is going to get called like
mm,
thousands of times potentially, right? So like the more layers of abstraction you're building on top of the computer system, then the more times the low level things get reused. And then the
yep,
more times they get reused, that means the higher reliability percentage they need, or you're going to have problems, like really bad
yep,
problems. So if something's only
yeah,
like 97% reliable, it puts a hard limit on how many layers you build on top of it.
yeah. Like it's fine to use as a casual calculator when you're trying to, I don't know, figure out how much time you're going to have on the weekend. But if you used it
Right.
for like financial transactions, then you're very quickly going to run into catastrophic issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yeah. No, that makes sense. I agree with you about this now, by the way. Um, not that I know how to apply it particularly well yet, I think, in terms of like spotting those errors or uh, dealing with them honestly, maybe is a way to put it. Like, I feel like it's fairly easy to, for any particular case, like with something like comprehension, particularly with something like an elementary level thing, um, it'd be very easy for people to like deny that there was a real issue there, that it was just like, oh, because it was so easy, I wasn't paying as much attention or things like that, even though the point of the exercise is to pay attention. Um, but yeah, so it's an unsafe way to deal with it as well, because you don't actually spend time figuring out whether there is an issue or not. You just sort of presume there isn't. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Since having this perspective, I've noticed a lot of convergence on it from different groups or different people. For example, Super Smash Bros. Melee players, in that community, some of the advice or the common wisdom is one of the things the top players tend to do is be really, really perfect about the basic stuff. So that's a very
yeah,
similar idea. Getting their basics really perfect is what let them build up the more complicated stuff more successfully.
yeah. Um, it feels like there's a whole bunch of convergence in coding that comes to mind. Like not just the like maths example we had, but like the way you like build an application or like do tests or stuff like that. Um, I've found it really common that people like in an enterprise coding environment where like financial transactions are, well, not that we were building something with that, but in that sort of environment where things going wrong could be really bad, getting people to write tests was like really, really hard. Um, uh, yeah, so they weren't like, and I think partly it's because they've not practiced it, but then also like not valuing it, like not valuing the ability to make sure that you don't make any trivial mistakes or stuff like that. Um, that
Yeah,
you
there's a
can,
lot of overconfidence and carelessness there. And there's so many people have this sort of assumption that other people make mistakes or other people are biased or whatever, but they think that like they're better. It doesn't happen to them very much.
yeah. Oh, this is like, what is it, like 90% of academics think they're in the top 50% type thing. Um,
Yeah, probably.
uh, that's like, I mean, it gets brought up in like first year psychology. Um,
Yeah, I've heard that with
but yeah,
drivers.
yeah. Um, I
Yeah, so
imagine that
another,
it's,
go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, I imagine that anything where, if there's like something that's taken for granted, um, like because you have a license, you're like good to drive or whatever, or because you've got a PhD, you must be a really good thinker, or because you're employed as a professor, you must be like all of that sort of thing. Like there's, um, yeah, because there's like an expectation there. People are more ready to, especially if they've done anything beyond the strict necessity. Like, oh, I took, driving lessons, therefore I must be better than everyone else because most other people didn't, or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, so another coding example is when you start getting a bunch of technical debt, like the code base is disorganized or whatever, then it starts getting harder to add features. And you can keep going and adding features, but it keeps getting progressively harder. And eventually it becomes really hard to add new layers on top because the bottom is such a mess.
yeah. Um, I find that a lot with uh, like, so CI/CD stuff, and particularly when like applications get a bit bulky and they've got all these requirements and stuff, like just being able to like run it locally becomes an issue unto itself. Um, or like you've got to like deploy it to a dev environment, which takes like 10 minutes to test stuff. Um, so this is like, yeah, all the systems like uh, you push code up to GitHub and then that like triggers a webhook, which means that like some box downloads it and like installs, your Ruby
Yeah, yeah,
dependencies and then test and, all that sort
yeah.
of jazz. Yeah.
I know the general concept, just didn't know the acronym.
Um, one thing that I'm not sure of a good solution, I don't think anyone knows a good solution to it, But there's like a general problem with that and like infrastructure as code stuff. Uh, like where you try and describe what you want a system to look like in a markup language, where the only real way to test it is to run it. Um, this is partially due to like the systems that you're interacting with not having good like mocking frameworks or testing frameworks or stuff like that. But it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, a massive, massive industry-wide problem. I've actually sort of, yeah, been trying to think about this in the background a bit over the past few weeks.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
no,
why we have Selenium, right? Because people have too much trouble doing mocking for all their website testing. So they just need to run a fake browser or like a
yep,
headless browser.
yeah, even I mean, yeah, just downloading the source code used to once be okay, but because we've got all this JavaScript stuff, you need to run this like full fat environment to get everything to work. Which the other thing about that though is that some of the abstractions are much nicer when you do that because you don't have to like re-implement things on your like you don't
Right.
have to put
It's
any
convenient
special.
not to have to do mocking.
Yep, yeah.
Mocking is a bit special casey in some ways.
Um, Also then that like there's the general problem of like having errors in your tests. So like if you were trying to implement a function, how do you, this is actually maybe not a bad topic for one of these sort of things. But like if you're trying to test the function, like a function, how do you do that without re-implementing the function? Um, and how do you do it without just specifying stuff where someone could like just write the test or write the function to meet the test? This is another like enterprise sort of problem where that sort of thing happens a bit, but it's more specialized though. Um, and I'm not sure
Yeah,
who would be particularly useful for it, like because that's already out there as well. Then again, this is all about exercises. Not all of this is unique
yeah.
or lots of other
With
people have written it.
mocking, what you want to avoid is re-implementing complex behavior as part of the mocking. Like the
Hmm.
mocks should be very simple. If you're creating complex behavior there, then you're adding new sources of error and so on. And it's like
Yep.
you're adding kind of like duplicate code, and so that gets really bad.
Yeah. Um, I've run into this
It's
sort of
a
stuff where
it's a little like the
oh sorry.
solipsism issue in Fabric of Reality, where um, if you're interacting with like complex autonomous things, then it's like an external world. Whereas, so what you want to do with mocking is not create an external world, have like very simplistic things, so that the main code is the only actual real actor.
Yep. Um, yeah, like copy pasting entire payloads for the response to a request or whatever. Um, as opposed to trying to implement half a database to yeah actually um like repeat functionality.
Yeah,
Yeah.
testing is really interesting, I think, because um, very similar concepts should be used for philosophy. How do you create tests for your ideas that are quick and easy to run and like pretty reliable, even if it's not like, literally computer automated?
Hmm. That sort of yeah, all my pre-existing knowledge about testing doesn't really help me answer that, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
People develop a lot of rules of thumb so they can like quickly identify bad ideas that violate rules of thumb. But it's often a bit disorganized in special cases and not like organized principles enough.
yeah. Hard to vary occurs to me as something like that, where uh I've probably dismissed valid ideas because I thought they were easy to vary. Um, yeah, I know I've misapplied some of the ideas in BOI.
I think that's
But I only know that
common.
hmm, the only ones that I know that I've misapplied though are the ones where I've spotted the error, so I don't have a good way to to know if I've misapplied the other ones. Um,
The book does not give a lot of application guidelines. Like it doesn't have a lot of examples of how do you take these concepts and use them in the real world. It doesn't have a lot of like guidance where you'll catch your own errors in your understanding of the book. It's just here's the ideas, good luck. And it also doesn't explain how sort of bare bones it is in a certain way. It
Yeah,
doesn't present
yeah,
the problem to you of what sort of thing you're learning from, even though most people don't know or don't think about it actively.
yeah. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking about particularly one of the examples I'm thinking of is what do you call it, to do with like the only moral imperative is not to destroy the methods of correcting mistakes.
Yeah,
Um, which is probably one of the hardest things to apply in that like it's in a fictional dialogue, and in the dialogue it's only conjectured. Um, like it's if I feel like if there's anything that's hedged in the book, that's maybe one of the most hedged things. Um, I don't
that
know
one's actually an
necessarily
interesting
why.
case because it's hard to apply in full, but I think it's fairly easy to chunk it. So don't destroy the means of correcting errors means basically act rationally. This moves the problem to how do you act rationally. But like this argument, like why it is basically the point of the argument is to bridge the gap from between rationality and morality. Why does
Mm,
morality say act rationally? It's because rationality doesn't destroy the means of correcting errors, which you can understand what's immoral about that. So you can take this and understand how it interfaces with morality. And then you
mm.
can say, okay, that means we should act rationally. And then you can separately, you can put this out of your mind. Like you don't have to keep everything in your mind at the same time. And you can separate it and say, okay, how do we act rationally? What do I know about that? And so on.
Yeah. This actually
Which
opens up like a different. Oh yeah, sorry.
I was just gonna say, which people do know a lot of things about that, many of which actually are compatible with error correction. Like you do want to double check that your concept of rationality is actually error correction related, but a fair amount of those ideas are.
Yeah. Um, just thinking about one of the times where I tried to apply this was uh like in a situation where the reason that I ended up like thinking that I was misapplying it was that there was a pretty big like factor in another person's point of view that I didn't know about or consider. Um, and so while I think there are possibly problems with the application to begin with, in that it wasn't really as strict as I was thinking about it at the time, um, but uh, like because the reason that I changed my mind was to do with this other thing that I didn't really know about or consider before. I might have been able to figure it out if I'd thought about it, but it was pretty foreign to me. Um, and uh, yeah, and that doesn't actually like it sort of it makes sense that like a rational choice would change when like if a huge bit of information um like came up. Um, I guess the error in the application though was that because I hadn't realized this bit of information, it like had a really big impact on whether like uncorrectable mistakes might have been made. Um, in that, yeah, it was something that if that happened, then it would be much harder to correct those mistakes than any of the other mistakes that I perceived from like the other side as such.
That was overly abstract. I think it was pretty hard to follow.
Uh, yeah, no, I was oh the reason I was worried that the context would get in the way. Um, uh, it was about like it was dating a colleague was the thing, and the thing that I didn't realize was how much the the social dynamic stuff around like knowledge of date like people dating in a workplace affects women compared to men. Um, like it's a much bigger thing for women, and it impacts them a hell of a lot more. Um, this is sort of akin to the idea of like, if men sleep around, then it's like go you, and if women sleep around, then it's like ah you slut, something like that. Um,
Yeah,
is a rough
I'm
approximation.
I'm initially a bit skeptical of that. It's pretty off topic though. I think it would affect men a lot as well. Maybe not as much, but like still significantly in general.
Yeah. Um, I didn't consider it that big a deal at the time, but I didn't have a particularly bad like prediction of what would happen either. So Maybe I just misjudged that at the time. There are other situations where I definitely think that it would have a massive impact. But yeah,
Yeah, that sounds like a good example of the kind of thing where rationalist type people think, we can behave logically, this shouldn't be that hard, it shouldn't be that big a deal. And then traditionalist people think, you're violating social norms, this is dangerous, this has a lot of social meaning and impact. And so it's like a high risk thing.
yes, yeah, yeah. That your podcast on men and women being friends comes to mind. Um, I listened to that after all this happened, but it occurs to like that was one of the factors where I um really made me readjust my attitudes towards like traditional stuff. I guess.
Yeah, I think people, like, I disagree with both sides in the standard dichotomy because I think reason works. Like, fundamentally, it can work. But um, a lot of these problems are much harder to solve than a lot of the rationalists realize. Like, a lot of the rationalists, their skill level relative to the problems they're trying to deal with is way too low, and
Yeah,
they overestimate what they can do.
yeah, I very much agree. Um, so changing topic slightly to just what you mentioned there, like overestimating. Um, I feel like it's one of the reasons people are able to make such bad overestimations, and like in this case, why I've been able to make such bad overestimations at times, is uh like I mean, part of it is like the social dynamics of not bringing up problems with other people. Um, but yeah, not having like uh challenges or like things that really make you question your ability to do those sort of, or either the estimates that you've made, or like your ability to actually handle those problems rationally or think through them or stuff. Um, like, and especially if there's a failure somewhere, and then they do stuff like what's suggested in the choice, where they like blame the other people or things like that, or chalk it up to like reality is complex and there are unseen factors. So my reasoning was fine. It was just that, you know, there was too much in the world to pay attention to, or knowledge was hidden from you, or something like that. Um, like it's very easy for people to avoid the times where they do run into a wall because of their inability to make estimates.
Yeah, so there's a squeaky wheel gets the grease issue. If you raise the problems, you get blamed, even if you weren't actually the cause. You're the person who like found it problematic enough it had to be dealt with or something. Like if you would just shut up, we could all ignore it, people think. And yeah, a lot of low standards are normalized just throughout culture. Expectations are too low. Well, so they're too
Mm.
low in certain ways. Um, it doesn't do a great job of guiding people to a different philosophical approach. But on the other hand, like even with low standards, people screw up a lot. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Um, this feels synergistic with uh the thing we were talking about earlier with like oh yeah, when we were talking about small but f fundamental errors, um like with the uh elementary school comprehension stuff, a lot of
Yep.
the time people will make an excuse like that's not significant, so you shouldn't bring it up. So they'll sort of like judge that it's insignificant to the final like part of the thing or the conclusion or whatever else, or not significant enough to justify bringing it up in conversation, and then use that to say that it's not important to actually deal with these sort of errors um, at all. And yeah, anyway, I feel like those two attitudes have a lot of crossover.
I was actually looking at the LSAT today, and this is a sample LSAT, which is the test lawyers take. It's supposed to be like a logical oriented standardized test.
Is
And
this like before the bar or like after high school, before uni?
it's for law school admissions. So
Okay.
after
Is that
college.
oh, okay? All law degrees in the US are like you do a normal degree and then with your liberal arts major or whatever else, and then you do law school stuff.
Yes.
Okay, we have like two ways in Australia. There's you either do like 2 degrees at once, one of which is a law degree, or you come back later and do, I think it's called a Juris Doctorate at that point. So like the postgrad thing is a different name or whatever else.
Yeah. Anyways, it's full of errors, and the audience of people taking the test has a lot of like picky literalist type people. So they actually put fucking disclaimers in the directions. Um, Quote, for some questions, more than one of the choices could conceivably answer the question. However, you are to choose the best answer. That is,
Mm.
the response that most accurately and completely answers the question, which is very poor guidance.
It's
It
we
just
couldn't
means,
come up with better examples.
yeah, they just want you to pick the socially normal thing. Like, just pretend you didn't notice the ambiguities and try to think about what we meant. Like, mentally model us and your culture,
Mm.
and then use that to guide you. But they don't say it that way. They don't admit that's what they want you to do.
Yeah, one thing that uh, this reminds me of a bit that's different, but in terms of questions might have some similarities. Was I was reading. So one of the things you, oh yeah, I didn't even get through the first sentence because there were two links in it. It was a recent post of yours, and there was a bias about like ranking A and B more probably than just B. Um,
Yeah, that's called the conjunction fallacy.
that was it. Yeah. Um, anyway, so I mean I started going down that rabbit hole. Sort of thing. But the only way that I could see this sort of thing being valid is if the questions were deliberately designed to have like partial answers that were like explicitly partial in some way. Like that for those questions, someone had written like, you know, a few paragraphs about the various options and why these were the things that were being written. Like if there was that on the back end of the test, then I could sort of understand something like this. But this doesn't give the impression that that's what's there's not that much thought that's gone into it.
Do you mean that you think the people getting it wrong are silly? Something like that? Like they should have known
Uh,
better? Are you
when you
blaming
say
them?
the people getting it wrong, as in
The
the question writers,
the question answerers for the conjunction fallacy. I was trying to figure out
oh no
which
no,
group you were criticizing.
oh the authors of this LSAT test, um,
Oh,
in that like if they designed the questions so that some of the answers were explicitly partial, like and they had reasoning written down somewhere, so that there was like an objectively better answer, and it was deliberately designed like that, as opposed to just writing down a bunch of stuff and then trying to decide after the fact which one's the best answer. Um,
yeah, no,
like
what they just meant is we had too much trouble trying to make it unambiguous, so we
mm,
gave up. So good luck.
yeah, yeah. That's what I
And then they ask
roughly
you
take it from
questions
it.
like, which of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the economist's argument? The argument being this sample paragraph right here. And then like it's questionable whether it's an argument rather than a set of disjointed assertions that don't really have a logical flow to them or a conclusion. But you're supposed to figure out not the main conclusion. And
There's more than
uh,
one in like it's not very
I
big.
mean, so for example, they start with every business strives to increase its productivity. This is the first half of the first sentence. This could be a conclusion, you know?
Yeah,
Right? That's the type of thing that would
you
normally
could
be a
write an essay
conclusion.
about
But you can
just
also
that
use it
thing.
as a premise. So they're just sort of starting with this conclusion as a premise, I think. But it's very disjointed, like the logic doesn't work well, so it's really hard to tell what they mean.
Um, Seems like it'd be even worse if this was a sample from a larger text, like from a book, where they'd,
Yeah.
especially if they join together paragraphs, but that could be a conclusion in the book that's much bigger than like the firing employees harms the dismissed employees or something like that. I mean, I just jumped to the end because I presumed that was where the conclusion was going to be. Um,
Yeah, it's not.
and then the middle sentence, but all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the, or
Yeah,
not all efforts to increase.
yeah, this is what they want. I guessed it and I also confirmed with the answer key, but it's
That's
not.
the conclusion.
Yes, this is what you're supposed to take as a conclusion because this third sentence is in some form sort of an argument to help the second one. So this is the one that actually like builds on something in a way.
So
Like there's,
yeah, I mean,
if you try to look for like where did they give a reason for something, um, then you will find that like sentence 3 is to some extent giving a reason for sentence 2. However, you will also find that right here where they say for, that means because. This is actually a reason for this. And this is also an answer choice that's not correct. So it's pretty arbitrary.
yeah, I mean, I sort of the answer there. I mean, not that I've tried to answer the question, but like, not all efforts to increase productivity are beneficial to the business as a whole. I sort of see as like self-evidently true, as in because efforts don't like people make mistakes with efforts all the time where they
Ah,
try things that they think will do something, but then
yeah. So
so
but before I decided whether it was self-evidently true, I'd have two questions. One, what do they mean by productivity? And two, what do they mean by business as a whole? And I think both of those are undefined and quite ambiguous, and it makes it very difficult to decide whether any of this is true or not.
especially if you include the employees who are bound to get fired in the business as a whole, in which case uh like obviously it's not beneficial to them. Um, but it's not clear that you
Well,
should.
but see, when you evaluate beneficial to the business as a whole, even if you're including the employees for some reason, which would not be standard, like their personal benefit, even if you include that, it might still be net beneficial to the business as a whole. Are we talking about net beneficial, or are we talking about like superset, strictly beneficial,
Yeah.
with no downsides, right? Which I assume we're not.
It'd be difficult to talk, but I mean, the confusing thing about that is business as a whole is sort of maybe that's just a conflation of terms type thing, like business as a whole and like strictly beneficial. Um,
Like, I don't think that they know what they meant. That's my understanding. Like
no, well,
they
it would
just
be
literally cannot formulate an argument. This is the kind of thing that you should write except coherent. Like this is a one paragraph explanation of something, but make it make sense.
yeah. Um, I mean, part of the other thing that occurs to me is that if they actually made it coherent, it would probably be too easy to figure out what the main conclusion was. So it's a bad test question. Um,
No,
like
I don't
if
know
it,
about that. Some of them are a lot more coherent, and I still think they're okay test questions.
oh, okay, okay.
The second
I was
one's
thinking like if it,
better.
I was gonna say if that middle sentence was like, you know, at the end, and it was then like clearly not all efforts to increase beneficial like thing um are uh not all efforts to increase productivity fully beneficial to the business. The just thinking about it, I mean, I'm not sure the last sentence supports the middle sentence in
Not very well,
like
but I think it's intended to.
um like the sense of security of the retained employees is not nearly as important, for example, as like de-risking an existential risk of like 50% of the chance of your business failing. Um,
Yes, yes, there are definitely things to take issue with, but
so anyway, yeah, yeah. I could do that all day, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, being very picky, another thing I noticed is that the directions tell you to blacken the corresponding space on your answer sheet. However, you are not allowed to bring a black pen to the test. You are required to use a pencil with a dark gray graphite.
Hmm. As opposed to, I mean, they could have just said mark
They
or
could
like fill
have.
in the square or the circle or whatever. Um,
Yes, I don't know why they don't pick like more defensive wording or something. They seem to not know how to.
um, maybe it's because all the people who are good at doing lawyery word things are working as lawyers and not working as writing the test for lawyers.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know like how prestigious it is or how well it pays or whatever to be in charge of this stuff.
Yeah, no, it occurs to me as well after I said it that I think it's the uh in essence I was just re-expressing there's like a saying of oh, I can't remember what it is. It's like those who blah do blah, those who do blah do blah, and those who can't teach, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
Is a
I've
fairly
heard that kind of thing.
yeah, it's a fairly like pejorative way to treat teachers as well, which I think is like I know some teachers that were really good and they did it because they wanted to become teachers because they felt like it was going to be meaningful and that they like sought meaning in being good teachers. And there are other teachers who are terrible, which is yeah. Shouldn't be lumped together like that.
Yeah, I've heard a similar one. It says something like the B students become teachers because the A students go into business.
Mm, yeah.
I looked up blacken, by the way, and in 7 out of 10 dictionaries, the definition includes darken, so it works. But in 3 out of 10, it does not. So it's apparently somewhat controversial what it means.
Um, yeah. Which one's the? I mean, so you using ambiguous language, I feel like is probably a bad thing for lawyers to do. Um, but I also imagine that one of the, or some of the dictionaries might not be as prestigious as the other ones, and it'd be more likely for lawyers to, well, lawyers would have a predisposition towards the prestigious ones, I imagine. Um,
I was
and
just looking at major dictionaries. The ones where it didn't
okay, yeah.
offhand, I believe, were Webster's third, American Heritage fourth, and Macmillan. Like, they're all well-known brands.
Okay, yeah. I'm not really familiar with, well, I'm somewhat familiar with Webster's 1828 and 1913 now, but otherwise OED is the main one that always comes to mind. So which I imagine had darken as a thing. Would have been on Google,
Yeah,
but yeah.
it's not very important. I was just looking for how
Hmm.
they want you to make assumptions. They want you to like model social context and like don't just take everything completely literally, which is relevant to the conjunction fallacy because the this alleged fallacy involves people not taking the questions literally enough. But they're trained not to, and even when you take the LSAT, you're not supposed to be too literal. Like in your whole life, you're not supposed to be too literal. You get punished for that.
Hmm.
So like if you complained that it said blacken and that your pencil isn't black, you're just going to annoy people until you stop doing things like that.
So I feel like that makes sense, or it makes more sense in a lot of other cases, but particularly for law, like language choice is really important. Um, it
I
can be the
know, and
difference with
there's
like
stories
a
about commas
contract.
making the difference for contracts.
Yeah. Um,
Nevertheless, even the people who do the LSAT aren't very good at it. So you can imagine how much you get punished for noticing these kinds of things in other contexts that are not lawyer stuff.
yeah.
The cultural pressure is very strong, which is why we have things like the quote conjunction fallacy, where people don't take it literally. It's not the only cause, because some people actually can't do the math and have no idea how statistics works. You know, that's also a factor, but
Well, I think that was part of the selection with the betting stuff that they got people to do, right? Was to try and get
yeah,
around
that
that.
improved the results a bit.
I think it went to 50% having the fallacy, or 56% or something like that. Which is still like, yeah, very significant still.
Yeah, but people throughout their life do not take things all that literally, and are not allowed to socially. And it's
Mm.
ever present, even among people on less wrong, people who come to FI and think they're super literal. People have gotten complaints you're too literal their whole life, who have been called autistic. They'll come to FI and then they'll find that they're inadequately literal in a lot of ways. Like they will say that they requested something that they did not actually write a request for. They just sort of hinted that they wanted it. And I run
Yeah,
into that kind of
yeah,
thing all the time where FI is like too precise for the top 1% literal people. Um, I think that's
yeah.
like an important thing, and it's part of what makes it hard for people to engage with or have success with.
Mm. Um, no, I've been told that I'm like, or people have judged that I'd be on the spectrum type thing because I like take things literally or whatever else. Um, which in many ways as well is just taking people at their word, like not trying to read too much into what they were trying to say or whatever else. But um, but I find that really humorous somewhat in modern contexts of like going out and doing like media interviews or stuff like that that I've done the past few years. Or like yeah,
Right,
which is not
that's a
typically something.
very
Yeah.
different context where you're supposed to not be very literal at all.
Um, oh yeah, no, the not that I've been like with media stuff, that's like a different I've got like almost a different mindset for thinking about that. Because it can be like a really hostile environment and things like and you've got to uh yeah, you don't have a lot of time or a lot of space to be able to like answer things in details. So to do it well, you have to like play to the social dynamics of the interviewer. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, in the worst case, then the interviewer who might be like partial or nice to you might get hostile, um, which would be like really bad. Um, so that's like I don't even know how to start to integrate like stuff that I've learned from media training into some of the stuff I do, like know how to integrate it with like philosophy, or like with what we've been sort of talking about. Like the formation of messaging and things can work with that, but in terms of the more on the spot stuff or things, that's like yeah, it's a really big problem.
Yeah, there
But
is explicit rational analysis of social dynamics that you can learn about and start to get an explicit understanding of how that stuff works, which you can then practice so it becomes more intuitive. But it is a long process to learn how to imitate the normies and think how they do.
um, the other thing that occurs to me is that I think if you do it explicitly and you describe this to most people, then they would like accuse you of trying to manipulate people or things like that.
Yes,
Like
definitely.
it's bad to be explicit about trying to learn that stuff. You should just
Yeah,
be
you're
naturally good
supposed to
at it.
be a natural. Yeah, it's really unfair and harsh to say you're supposed to be a natural. You're not allowed to practice and learn it and so on.
Um, it also occurs to me that, like many things, learning about it, like it's good to know. So it's like learning about like hostile attack vectors with uh, like computer stuff. Is that um, yeah, a lot of that is not so that you can go hack other people. It's so you can prevent people hacking you. Like if you don't know how to manipulate people, in principle at the very least, you have no idea how people manipulate you. Um,
Yeah,
And so, yeah, that attitude makes it much easier for the people who are naturally good at it to control the people around them, which maybe is a like a bit of a self-sustaining cycle there, in that there's like a meme about that naturally good people have that then they, spread continuously. Um, yeah.
yeah. So I have a short story that maybe gives some perspective on what kind of world we live in and what you're up against when you want to communicate things to people. So are you familiar with reCAPTCHA? I think that's the name of it, the one with the images where you have to like click on the squares that have a crosswalk or a fire hydrant or something.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I used to think that the way it worked frequently was you had to do two CAPTCHAs in order to continue, because I frequently just got a second one. It turns out that is not how it works. That is what happens when you fail the first CAPTCHA. So my failure rate was something like 80%. Like it was very high to the point that, and I did not know I was failing them because it didn't tell me. And my friend told me how to do them. And what you do is you pretend that you're a normal person and do it really carelessly, and do it wrong on purpose. And now my success rate is like 95%, no problem.
Um,
And the way these
oh yeah,
things
sorry.
work, I think, is that it's based on like what do most people answer? Like, can you give the standard answer? And that's how they detect humanness.
Yeah, so
So it tells you something about like statistically in aggregate what people are clicking on, and they literally get questions wrong, like click on all the squares that contain fire hydrant, and they'll just skip squares that contain a chunk of a fire hydrant.
yes, yeah. Um, do you know uh like, do you remember, or do you know why reCAPTCHA is a like what Google their like profit motive for doing it is?
I don't think I know. I know there was the one where you had to type in two words, and they were using it for OCR, but I haven't
Yeah,
really
so
thought about the. Well, so the reCAPTCHA would be for like object detection, like they want to improve their image algorithms by having
yeah,
you tell them where the thing is in the image, right?
so yeah, the reCAPTCHA version one was the text where they would show you two words, one of which was judged against human answers, and the other one was used to train AI. Um,
Yeah,
then with reCAPTCHA version two, you might remember that now they ask about fire hydrants and chimneys and things, but a little while ago they asked about buses and cars, and before that they asked about numbers and houses and stuff like that. Um,
and
after they
storefronts.
after they were asking about numbers, all the numbers on Google Maps got blurred out. Um, they're working on self-driving cars now. Would it be useful to know what's a fire hydrant and what's not? Um, so
I
yeah, so
see.
they use it to train like or AI is not the right term, machine learning
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So like neural nets or whatever. Um, but this is sort of an interesting point because it's like no wonder AI has trouble if they're using stuff like this and like people are super lazy. Like if it can't detect I mean, what it's really guarding against is like they're presuming that they have the capability to make the best AI or the best like neural net to solve this one problem in the world more than anyone else, partially because they've got this like captive resource via reCAPTCHA. And so if
Yeah.
anyone was able to make a better one, then well, they obviously need a new version. But because they're the best at it, then no one's going to be able to do that. Um, but it brings up this interesting point about like the error rate, like and the quality of training data. If people are really lazy like that, which yeah, I've had like sometimes I've done like 3 or 4 in a row, um, and which is always really weird to me. Sometimes there's been stuff like just chimneys that don't look like chimneys or things, but um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's interesting. I haven't thought about it from that point of view though, of trying to match the norm rather than, which then, if people started doing that en masse, then removes the much of the benefit of using it as training data.
Yeah. A lot of it seems to be they literally won't count a square if only like 5% of the square has the target. They seem to just assume
Mm,
if it's too small, you shouldn't count the square. That seems to be like a theme of what people do. Like, look for the ones that
yeah.
are like 50% chimney.
I think there might also be some people just don't uh don't recognize an object. Um, uh, yeah, like storefronts used to sometimes be like that, where I'd get a higher error rate, particularly with things that were like a bit ambiguous. Um, and so if people like, yeah, just do a really quick pass, then
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes they might see half a fire hydrant and click it because it's obvious, and other times they might see the bottom of the fire hydrant and not realize what it is, so not click it. Um, like yeah, it's I don't know what the that'd be sort of just an interesting fly on the wall type thing to see what people are actually
Yeah.
doing
See,
inside their heads.
my like initial algorithm that made sense to me was click all the squares so that you're fully surrounding the target thing. Like, you know, click a big enough
Oh, if it was
area
like
that you
one
have
big
fully contained it.
um so you're talking about when because I mean they've gone through so many versions, like when there was like a picture of a fire hydrant over like 16
Yeah.
squares or something,
Yes,
and
that
you've got to
one.
select like 7 of them that overlap. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if it's just like the little top of a fire hydrant being in there, then most
Right.
people are just
People
like,
will just
whatever,
leave
it's
it
not part
out.
of it. Hmm.
I had one the other day where there was a crosswalk, but it was in the background, and there was also a crosswalk in the foreground. So I only clicked the foreground one and I ignored the background one, which took up like most of a square. And I still got it right by skipping the background one that people didn't bother with.
Yeah, wow. Um, huh. Anyway, um, yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, low standards, that was where we came from.
Yeah, and
Anything
people
else,
do
Hatch?
not follow instructions very literally. Like they have some sort of socially normal idea of what you should do or what seems normal to them or what seems like a regular amount of effort or something like that, and then they operate based on that. And when you try to talk to them, they interpret like virtually everything you say that way, and that causes a lot of communication errors.
Yeah.
They
So oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, you remember like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or something, I um brought up an example of it was like 4Cs, like the community contribution contract code or something like that, um, where someone had said like increase the quality of the decision making process by increasing diversity or something.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and when I was talking to the guy who suggested it, um, like it became pretty obvious that he and I think like many people, there's an assumption like one of the social norms is about the amount of error correction that you should do on other people, and so this is the oh you know what I mean, like it wasn't a significant error type attitude. Um,
Yeah,
And that I find like if you know a bit about philosophy, then I think it becomes really obvious that it's a bad attitude because you don't have a way, like if the author was that sloppy, then you don't actually have a way of knowing whether you're interpreting the same thing as other people. And if you're actually wanting this to be something like in this case, I mean, it had the word contract in there. I think that's over the top, but it's contribution guidelines. If someone like argued about this, then only then, when there was a problem, would people actually think it was important to try and resolve the ambiguity. But that's too late because you've got to have like for similar to like laws and governments and stuff, you want to be in a secure environment where you've got reasonable guarantees about what is safe to interpret in what ways, and that you're not going to get caught out. Um, and that you don't want people to be able to catch other people out by like changing the meaning after the fact or by deliberately misinterpreting things. Um, anyway, yeah, but this social norm of like doing error correction on other people's parts, I think is it's sort of stupid because you're just getting two parts, like you've got two elements of laziness. You've got laziness in the expression and then laziness in the error correction. And so you've got lots and lots of places to make mistakes.
yeah, I think there are legitimate versions, like, so the typo te is very common, TEH. And like if I see
Yep,
that, I know what they meant to write. Like in almost all contexts, I can figure out what they wanted. Um, so I think the existence of legitimate "you should have error corrected this for me" cases, I think they conflate the two. They don't think about what the border is, or is this really one of those? They know there are legitimate cases, and then they assume theirs is one because it seems really intuitive to them. And they don't have like objective criteria for is this actually one of the cases the other person should have error corrected for me. And the proper criteria is can I actually name at least two different interpretations that make some sort of meaningful difference? And
yep.
if I can name two interpretations, then I have a valid complaint and it makes sense to do a clarifying question or criticize it for ambiguity or whatever. And if I don't, if I only have one interpretation that makes sense to me, then I should error correct it for them and not make a big deal out of it. I think that's okay. The problem is that they're not receptive to this actually looks ambiguous to me, like I don't know what you mean. Because they think like, well, obviously I mean X, not Y, because X is common sense. And I'm like, I can't judge what you think is common sense for you. That goes beyond what I want to
Mm.
do for you.
Particularly in like an environment like the internet where you've got like vastly different cultures. Um,
Yeah.
like even just the other day, I you know made an emote on Discord for like TA, like ta, which is a in British Australian thing is thanks. Um, but because I there was a place where
Right.
I
See,
was testing
I
it out.
hear ta and I think it means farewell. That was my guess.
Oh yeah, usually we say tata for that.
Yeah, ta
So oh
ta for
tata.
now. I've heard that one. So I thought ta was
Um,
just a shortening for bye.
yeah, no, and that makes sense. But in one of the when I was testing it out, like Justin saw the thing and he was actually confused because I'd tested two of them in slightly different colors and it looked like tata. Um,
Ah,
um, so there's like a whole bunch of different like miscommunications and ambiguities there. One thing that occurs to me is that people are bringing standards of error correction from like really casual stuff, where like two friends talking, it's far more common to be way more lax. Um, and I think that's okay, right? Because especially when you know the other person and you've got like a good sense for what ideas they have and how they think. Um,
I think
because
it
the
fails way, way more than people realize.
um, Yes, I agree, but I think in these circumstances it has like a relatively low impact most of the like in social situations or whatever else.
No, no, no.
Like if you're
So,
at oh
for
sorry,
example,
okay.
um, people will get married, and then 10 years later they'll get divorced and say, I never really knew him at all. I never knew he thought that. This is so unreasonable of him. Like, people can be married for years and not know what a lot of the actual opinions of their spouse are because they've glossed over all their disagreements and not brought them up and so on.
And then maybe
Uh,
only when frustrations rise to a point do they actually like get serious enough to try and figure out what the person actually meant or whatever else. Um,
yeah, they end up fighting and eventually things start to come out a little bit over time gradually.
yeah. Um,
And friends
okay, yeah.
sometimes last even longer because they they fight less, they have more distance, they can just ignore each other when things aren't working, and then try to do like the things that do work better. So it's like even easier to avoid the problems because they're not trying to live together or whatever. They're
Yeah.
coordinating less and more on a selective basis. So then it's easier for them to never really know each other at all and stick to stereotypical defaults.
Um, yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess maybe I'm making a sample bias as well in that I don't have many friends that I have for like purposes that I keep outside of or like beyond the scope of having serious discussions about stuff. Um, like I can see, for example, like tennis partners, for example, might know that they vote for different parties and they both feel strongly about politics, but they sort of agree not to talk about it because they care about the tennis. I can see stuff like that, and then maybe if one of them changes their mind on something later on, then there could be a big disagreement or something. Particularly when people get like have attitudes. So I had this came up
Yeah.
recently where, sorry, I've like
Go
gone
ahead.
on tangents, but uh, so I was reading one of Deutsch's old posts on setting the world to rights about wearing the Israeli flag, and it mentioned in there
Yeah. Are you aware
the
of
town
Justin's
square test.
archive of that?
Uh, I'm not sure. I mean, I know like it's on archive.org from many different years.
Justin got an archive set up for setting the world to rights.
Oh, cool. I might have seen some of
See
it.
this?
Yep,
Yeah. PDFs
nice.
with titles and a download all button.
Oh, good, good, good. Yeah, no, that's cool. Um, yeah, like archive.org works for a one-off article, but it's definitely not like easy to browse or whatever else. Um, no, that's good. Um,
These people
anyway,
did
the
not
town,
archive their stuff, so we had to do it for them.
yeah, it's a, yeah, bit of a shame. Um, the, oh yeah, so the town square test is brought up in there. Um, basically, can you go to a town square and say what you think and not be afraid of violence or retribution or things like that? Um, obviously there's some interesting application. Well, um,
Yeah, I mean,
we're
ask
doing
me how
pretty
many
bad about.
MAGA hats I own.
Um, one thing that occurred to me about that though, outside of the modern context, was so I had this uh, in like grade 10 for whatever reason, I went through like a whole bunch of different political philosophies in a short space of time. Um, like I started reading like anarcho-communist stuff and then uh, like or just regular anarchism stuff and whatever
Yeah,
else.
did you run into
Um,
Godwin?
um, I can't remember. I didn't get too much into capitalism at that stage because I'm not sure if like well I still haven't read much of Goblin. Um, but um,
He's
but a
often
lot of that came.
categorized as more like an anarcho-socialist. I
Oh,
think the
okay.
categorization is not very good, but that kind of subculture reads him.
So the main thing that came up, I think, was
He's a bit mixed and ambiguous in some ways, so there's like room for interpretation for different traditions to try to claim him.
yeah,
Right,
okay.
like
So for
Kropotkin.
whatever.
Some people associate Godwin as similar to Kropotkin and will like name them in the same breath.
Oh, okay. I mean, I don't know much. I didn't actually end up reading this. I think I printed it out or something or other. Um, but I sort of ran into issues before that, I guess. Um, but I mean, on the one hand, it was based on like if everyone understood what I understood, then the world would be better, which is like a ridiculous thing to think. Um, but the other thing was that I had this idea of like we should like socially ostracize people who do things that we don't morally approve of, and we should be like ready to do that or whatever else. And I feel like that era is a
Like
massive
cancel
part of what,
culture.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and so I had that idea for like a month or something in grade 10 and then rejected it. And it's sort of like, I don't know. Um, it's bizarre to me how some of these ideas have become so popular. Um, in that part of the reason that I got rid of that, by the way, was that I learned a bit about economics. and about stuff like if you want the best stuff in your life, then you need access to the largest market. And doing this social ostracization stuff, or like worse, I mean, in history, it's been readily practiced as violence or beheadings or whatever else type thing. Um, but that means that your life will not be as good as a life where you don't like take things out on people like that, where you allow people to have their own ideas, and you don't treat them as like the devil for not believing what you believe.
Yeah, the your comments about finding it yourself and believing it for a month and then changing your mind reminded me of Ayn Rand's comment that an error made on your own is safer than 10 truths accepted on faith. Because a lot
Yeah.
of the cancel culture people, they didn't really find it on their own and they're not really critically thinking, and it's a different attitude, so it's a lot more dangerous.
Well, for them to reject it as well is now like there's massive social implications potentially. Like if they've got, 100 friends and all of them believe this, then that's really hard. Whereas if they thought this themselves and then rejected it, then there's no implications like that. Um, yeah. Um, no, I agree with that. I think that's a
Yeah,
good
that's
way
the
to put it.
quote on Justin's sidebar as well, because of the means to correct your errors part.
Oh yeah. Um, yeah, yeah. This is like, I don't know, maybe it's a topic for, well, it's definitely a topic for another day because it's longer than 7 minutes. Um, but one of the things that gets me is when so I, don't know much about Rand's ideas, in terms of I've only read The Fountainhead and stuff that's I've been introduced to through FI. Um, but when I say things to people about like one of the examples actually is I think it's actually the Wikipedia summary, or let me see if I can find it real quick. Um, I'm not sure if it's on her page or Objectivism. Might be Objectivism. Um, so actually, um, might have just been the definition on Google. Um, no, I thought that was a good thing, but that's anyway. There was a phrase that I found, or a sentence or a description somewhere that I found that was one of those things where I think a lot of what she's said are things that people would in isolation think are pretty decent ideas. Maybe they're like they need a bit to think about it, but they're things that uh like people don't intuitively have too much of a problem with. I need to find some examples, but
Some are, some aren't. It
yeah.
depends, but she's, pro-capitalism, attacked environmentalism, attacked collectivism, attacked altruism. So those are some like hot button issues that just offend a lot of people.
Um, yeah, self-responsibility though is like, I mean, I feel like in terms of stuff like taking
Self,
responsibility for oneself,
yeah, self-responsibility is something that like everyone pays lip service to, but it's not actually that popular. So if you actually make a crusade out of it and point out ways people don't live up to it, then you're going to annoy people.
and yeah, I was going to say she took that idea seriously when most people don't. Like if you actually follow it to conclusions, then there's a lot of conclusions people don't like, essentially. Um,
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, but it was one of those, as I started to, uh, maybe I actually took some, I don't think I did. Um, oh, I've just got, yeah, those two things there. Um, but yeah, like I played some audio clips with people to some friends and stuff about one of them was it was like a 5 minute thing from it might have been a PBS channel did an animated thing where she's arguing about like the nature of love and selfish versus non-selfish love and stuff like that. Um anyway, yeah, and the friend I was talking to is like reflected on like his relationship with his family recently, and found like a lot of resonance, uh which I thought was good, but so like there's such a strong negative reaction towards her that I think people well, ultimately they cut themselves off from good ideas via that reaction.
Yeah, a lot
Um,
of that is reputation and knowing that she's socially shunned, and so they want to fit in.
um, BioShock, I didn't realize until like less than a month ago, that like the protagonist in, or not the protagonist, the first
Yeah,
antagonist.
there's some questionable connections there. It's not like really serious as the objectivist though.
Oh, I think it's like they have not at all like what the authors
Oh,
of
you think it's
BioShock
a
did.
straw man? I haven't played the game. I've just seen a couple of reviews.
I mean, the guy you're introduced to is Andrew Ryan, and there's so like I it was one of those things where when I heard the name, it was like one of those moments where a whole lot of stuff uh like I realized really quickly. Um, but it's sort of like if there were if you could take sound bites of like a paragraph where there's three sentences, the first sentence might be roughly on point. The second sentence is like, okay, where's this going? And then the third sentence is like a complete butchering in terms of a conclusion. Like it is so far off it feels like it's meant to be a criticism of Rand and objectivism, and it just entirely misses the mark. Um,
Yeah.
like I started playing it again, and I just couldn't get like I had to take a break really quickly, like within like an
Okay.
hour, because it was
Well, that sucks.
like frustrating how much they misinterpret things.
Yeah. So, I just think these Mises quotes because you were saying how it'd be hard for people to object to Rand stuff in some ways, and a few years ago, I quoted some small selections from Mises about harmony of interest and peace. He's in favor of, people can get along with each other and have social cooperation and not have violence. And I gave some short quotes and whatever in response to a direct question asking for them. And I was met with like hostility, like no one actually wants it or is interested. Um, Even when you just have like short quotes, they're like, "Oh, fuck these Mises guys, fuck right wing." They can be quite hostile to excerpts that if you just read the excerpt, you're like, how could anyone oppose that? But they manage to.
Did they they knew that it was Mises though?
Yeah, yeah. It's in the archive somewhere, but I don't know where. But it was a
Um,
very old
is
Reddit thread.
this term, by the way, harmony of interests, is that a term Mises came up with?
No, I know Bastiat used it, and I don't think it was original to him.
Okay, yeah, but Rand has some ideas about that as well, right?
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah. It's
in Atlas
Mises
Shrugged
always
particularly.
refers to it as a standard classical liberal doctrine or belief
Okay,
or
yeah.
whatever.
So it was evidently, yeah, the idea was around long enough before him for him to talk about it like that, I suppose.
Yeah. So
Um,
then other things quickly. Yeah, so about people hiding disagreements, you were talking about how like in intellectual circles where you have discussions, you're going to know about what they're like more. But even at FI, people have disliked things about what I do or how they think the community works or whatever, and just hidden it for years, despite explicit discussion of it, like by me and others. And they don't like it, and then they pretend to like it and hide their disagreement, pretend to agree with it or be fine with it, so it's like the issue comes up. They know there's an issue, but they still hide it so people can do that for years, which is lame, but they do it. It is a thing
so,
that you should expect to run into with people.
um, something comes to mind in terms of like very relevant to this. It's not exactly the same, I think, because I think I've like back in like 2017 or something, um, there was political related discussion or something that I was involved in where I think I made it clear that I wasn't a fan of Trump or whatever. Um, I'm actually really unclear. The more I like my attitude at the moment is that so I know you're pro-Trump sort of I don't know in what context essentially, whether that's like just a out of the presidential candidates we have or because I like last night I was listening to I think for the second time the podcast on trade deficits. Um,
Oh yeah,
and you sort of point,
he's really bad on trade war stuff. Like he doesn't know economics. But like out of the actual options available, not just presidential candidates, but just like politics in general, he's pretty good. He's pretty moderate, reasonable, pro-America. A lot of people are far worse. He's not a super big government authoritarian type like most of them. Like he's not
hmm,
super effective at draining the swamp, but he's not pro-swamp. He's actually anti-swamp.
Yeah. At the end of the
He's
day, even
standing
churn is
up to
better
some of
than
the entrenched
stability.
interests and trying to make some things better.
Yeah, so the attitude that I've taken is I still think well, I'm more aware that I don't understand your full like explanation or point of view on it. Um, and I don't think that I have well, I definitely don't have the time at the moment, but I also am not sure I've got the like prerequisites to try and discuss it. So it's not that
Yeah,
I'm,
I don't particularly recommend politics anyways. It's
yeah, that's the other
like
thing is I felt, yeah,
there's better places to put your effort in general.
um, this just occurs to me as something that might be similar to hiding disagreements, but I don't feel like it is, partially because I'm fine talking about it, but just not prioritizing. Um, I mean, actually, I think what's on in my head is very different to like hiding disagreements for years. Um, I suspect. But anyway, it was just a thing that, yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about recently in terms of whether or how do I find out more, I guess was um the thing. How do I resolve this if I wanted to? Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
but
So
it's also not something I've sought out. I've prioritized other things in the meantime. Sorry, yep.
yeah. So we're out of time. So for next time,
Yep.
try to do some sort of writing exercise. One of the things we talked about, and for the text analysis and grammar videos, um, I think you might want to try to go through them a bit faster. Like it's going fairly slowly to get through them, and I think
Yeah.
if you went at a quicker pace, you could maybe get something like, 80% of value with 20% effort. Like, you don't have to try to capture all of the value. Just going through it and getting a rough idea has some value. And then you can make choices about what to rewatch and put extra attention into. Um,
Yep.
but like you can simultaneously have like one or two areas where you're focusing your detail attention, and then also at the same time, keep making steady progress on a couple other things where you're not trying as hard, but you're still going through it and learning something.
Yep.
Like some lower
Um,
standard, easier stuff.
I had some thoughts about this that I won't go into now, but I also came up with some ideas about what to do about them. So I'm going to try that in the meantime. But I'll also write anything down and things so we can discuss it on, well, next week. Um,
Okay.
cool. All right. Thanks for today. Catch you in three days. Yep.
All right. Two, or yeah, three.
Two. Yep. Cool.
All
All
right,
right.
bye.
Ciao.